Let's begin this afternoon on line number 2, David Vardy. Hello, David. You're on the air.
Hello, Patty. How are you?
I'm fine, sir. Thank you for calling today.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to respond.
It's my pleasure, sir. You go ahead and pick up where you would like based on my commentary earlier, and then we'll have a chat.
Great. Sounds good. Okay, two things I wanted to talk to you about. Both of them, of course, relate to the article that was published yesterday in the Financial Post. And the first issue I want to talk about really relates to the loan guarantee, because it's the loan guarantee, among other things, that makes this a national issue, because it puts the federal taxpayer on the hook. And the question is, to what extent is that a real obligation or liability to the government of Canada? Mm-hmm. And I wanted to deal with that by quoting there was back in January, Minister Tom Marshall, spoke about the loan guarantee, and he described the fact that this loan guarantee was going to be a non-recourse guarantee, okay? Now, what does he mean by that, by a non-recourse? This was June the 29th, comments by Tom Marshall on Open Line.
Right. And
he talked about how there is a federal loan guarantee, and the Nalcor debt will be non-recourse to Nalcor. And Mr. Marshall said the debt part is in Nalcor, guaranteed by the Government of Canada, and it's non-recourse funding.
Right.
Now, to be honest with you, I'd never heard of such non-recourse funding before, and I talked to some people in the financial markets who could, understanding is essentially the guarantee is provided, it's in place, and the Government of Canada, if there's a default by Nalcor, then the Government of Canada is obliged to come forward and backstop the loan. And that essentially means that they don't go to the province. And that was a surprise to me, okay?
It was to me, and when I heard that, I spoke to some people as well, and I think our understandings are similar in that when you have a guarantee, then, of course, you do the non-recourse is the fact that no one can be held accountable but for those who sign the guarantee. It's like if You're my father, you sign for my car loan, I default, you make the payment.
That's right.
But I think your extension that you make here, sir, and you heard my commentary on it, I'll reiterate it, we can discuss it, is that I believe that's a stretch for national impact and for people to wake up and read and understand and digest your points, because this falls straight on the back of the ratepayer. The long road between the federal taxpayer being on the hook and what is the reality, in my opinion, for Muskrat Falls is we would all have to simultaneously go bankrupt. The province would have to walk away from its liabilities here, and then, of course, the asset associated with it. And then it would go to the federal government, who has the option to pick up their guarantee or signing and or divvy it up between the federal taxpayers, and I don't think that makes any sense, sir. Do you?
Well, I go back to the transcript. I have a copy of the transcript of what Mr. Marshall said. He said only the project itself can be touched. They couldn't touch the oil and gas. That is to say, the assets belonging to Nalcor, the oil and gas assets. Mm-hmm. So they can't touch the hydro. They can't touch the hydro things like that, so there would be no recourse to the province. Okay, so that's exactly what he said. The recourse would be the Government of Canada under the guarantee. What that essentially means is that the Government of Canada would not be required to, or the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador would not be required to step up and pay in the event of default. Now, your point about the ratepayer is a good point, because the fact of the matter is the risk is really on the ratepayer.
Yes.
The ratepayer has to pay. The problem becomes if the cost of the electricity is so high that the ratepayer simply can't pay, then you've got a situation where the power consumption is going to decline substantially, because people can't afford to pay because the cost is too high. And so then you could have a situation where the revenue would be insufficient to cover the cost. And that's fundamentally my biggest problem with Muskrat Falls. It's the cost. It's the cost per kilowatt hour. Because using Nalcor's figures, the cost of that power, the Muskrat Falls power, including the transmission and the generation, is close to 30 cents per kilowatt hour, okay? Yes. And what you and I are paying in our homes today is 10.5 cents per kilowatt hour. We're looking at the cost of delivering this power to the island, to Soldiers Pond, in the high 20s. We're looking at a number in the high 20s itself. When you blend it with other power, then that goes down, okay? That becomes a lower number.
And then, of course, that's the 16.5 blended rate for Ireland and Labrador, well, for Ireland ratepayers. And then going the other way, the 20-odd still is applicable because the blended rate doesn't apply for wheeling it through Atlantic Canada down to the northeast United States.
Right. So the big problem is the fact that if this power is so high, if the cost is so high, then it could become prohibitively expensive.
Mr. Vardy, let me jump in on that. A couple of things, sir. When you comment on usage and how the usage will decline dramatically based on the cost, I mean, historically, we don't operate like that. When it goes to the price of gas, we continue to be gluttons and we burn it. When it comes to the cost of heating our homes, people do indeed light a fire, put on a sweater, turn it down a degree or two less than they would in the past. But that doesn't seem to ever really nip into the profitability of utilities. And when it comes to all the federal government's role and any of that stuff, but do you factor in the cost of the escalation in the cost of power, regardless of Muskrat Falls, the use of alternatives, whether that be, and your condemnation of the pub terms of reference, I completely agree. But when you talk about the exorbitant cost, we don't even have anything to compare it to currently, so I don't even know where the merit of that lies. We don't know how much it would cost to use LNG or Grand Banks gas or wind or anything else. So is that not just a little bit of, I hate fear-mongering as a phrase, but is that not worrying people unnecessarily without anything to directly compare it to?
Economists use a term called elasticity, demand elasticity.
Right.
What that essentially means is that over a period of time, people will respond to changes, okay? They respond to increased prices. They move away from the product.
Yeah.
That's what's happening with heating oil in this province, because we are pricing electric heat below the actual cost at Holywood, and that's causing 85% of new space heating, new homes, to be using electric heat. So there's a movement away from oil, okay? So the pricing system does work. When the price is lower, people will gravitate toward it. Price is higher, they move away. They're moving away from furnace oil, stove oil, because of that very fact, okay?
But the example you're using just pushes them towards electricity, which sort of diminishes the argument in the first place.
But if the price goes up, if consumers find that they've got to pay 20 to 25, 30 cents a kilowatt hour, then that's going to change, okay?
They're going to go back to oil-fired?
They're going to start using more, they're going to use other alternatives. There are lots of alternatives out there. One of them that more people are using is pumps.
Heat pumps.
Is geopumps, geothermal heat pumps, okay, and ambient heat pumps. And you're going to see a lot of that. You're going to see a lot more use of that than you did in the past. So I think that what you're going to see here is, in fact, you're going to see elasticity. Demand is going to change. Prices go very high. Now, if they don't go higher, then this may not be a big issue. But there's always the potential risk, and the potential risk relates primarily to the high cost. So I go back then to is it a national issue? It's a national issue, as you mentioned in your prologue. It's a national issue from an environmental standpoint, because we're all concerned about the greenhouse gases and particulate emissions and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. There are some advantages with Muskrat Falls, no question about that. But one has to look at it in the context of the overriding issue, which is cost. Can we afford it? Can we afford this? This is the big problem. This is why, in my opinion, all the data, all the information has to go before the Public Utilities Board before any final decision is taken.
Are you asking the federal government to really overstep their boundaries to have a caveat on the loan guarantee based on the PUB?
I'm suggesting that in doing their due diligence, they should ensure that all of the bases are covered, that every stone should be looked at, that we should be looking at all the major risk factors. And the question then becomes, is the Public Utilities Board the appropriate instrument to do this?
Okay.
And that was one of your questions. Okay,
yes,
so I would like to respond to that question. Now, on that issue, as we indicated in our article, there is a legislative requirement under the Electrical Power Control Act, and that was introduced by Clyde Wells back a few years ago. The Electrical Power Control Act basically says that the Public Utilities Board is the agency that's responsible to ensure that the power is delivered to consumers, at the lowest possible cost consistent with reliable service. There's no other agency in this province that has that mandate, right, other than the Public Utilities Board. So I can't see why anybody would argue that the PUB is not the appropriate venue to hear this.
I think you also heard my commentary associated with that, sir, when I say that this is government being their own worst enemy by prematurely putting in front of the PUB. When people speak to, when anybody, Mr. Cash in particular, he says, to talk about the anti-democratic approach to this project, look no further than what happened at the PUB in the past. But it was a flawed starting point. Do you agree with that? If we didn't have all the final information for them to consider, what were we even doing in front of the PUB? And when we hired, I'm sorry?
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the point of the matter is that we didn't have the cost estimates. We had cost estimates that we presented before the Public Utilities Board that were based on 10% of the design work. So that's somewhat ridiculous to ask the PUB to make a decision with regard to costs when those costs are subject to such imprecision. And here we are now. This is 6 months after the PUB brought down their report. We still don't have the cost numbers. So what was the big rush? Why couldn't we have waited and gotten the numbers together? Which brings me to Nova Scotia, because Nova Scotia is going to be, they actually make a decision on this.
Right.
There's been no application to the Public Utilities Board, to the Utilities and Review Board in Nova Scotia, and I'm told it may not be until Christmas. So I have to ask the question, why are we rushing this? Why don't we take the time to do our due diligence? There's no energy crisis, so why can't we just take the time and do this right? Because it's all well and good to say this has been studied to death and there's been no public policy decision subject to greater scrutiny, but there shouldn't be. This is the biggest project. This is the one that deserves the greatest scrutiny. Have we given it the due diligence it deserves? I think not.
On that front, Mr. Vardy, when you say to take the time and study to death, study to death for me requires the black and white of all the alternatives and the legitimate evaluation of costs and everything associated with it. So on that issue, when the government releases, as they say they would, whether or not they do remains to be seen, their complete evaluation of the major alternative options, whether that be purchase of LNG from New Brunswick or the Irvings, a pipeline, Grand Bank gas, wind, I think are the three we can expect to see an evaluation of. At that point, and Muskrat Falls, let's use a round number, $8 billion. I don't know what it'll be, no more than anybody else. Let's use 8. If you can save $3 billion by doing gas, LNG, something like that, does that automatically make it the best thing to do, given the fact that even the MMBTU cost of gas today is $3.50, up about $1 in the last 18 months? To rely on the volatility of that market, to know that we're always at the mercy of purchasing from someone else as opposed to applying that money to a asset, which at some point will be an asset without question. So is it always dollar for dollar what's the cheapest, or should there be some evaluation of the foresight of money down into an asset or money down for purchase and padding someone else's pocket? I ask that as a legitimate question.
A very, very legitimate question. The risk is always very important as to how reliable the numbers are, and if the forecasts can you take them to the bank? You can never take them to the bank because oil prices and gas prices are always so volatile.
Right.
So, but my concern is that there are solutions here, small solutions that we can be taking, small hydroelectric projects. I'm not a big fan of mega projects. I think that if we look at the history of Newfoundland and Labrador, the history of mega projects has been a disaster for us. We look at the Labrador Liner Board. The Upper Churchill project. We didn't get the benefits we were assured we would get.
Is that fair, though, to use that as a reason against Muskrat Falls?
No, well, I think you've got to look at Muskrat Falls in terms of the risk, and the bigger the project, the bigger the risk. So that's why I think it is fair to really look at Muskrat Falls very carefully in terms of its size, but also to jump out and say natural gas is the solution. I would first look at all the easier solutions being conservation, replacement of electricity by geothermal heat pumps, improved insulation. We can spend a lot of money in this province, in the small communities all around the province, by putting in better insulation. We can do it cost effectively. We can do it by generating economic activity throughout all the province, and not simply pay a bunch of high-priced engineers. So I think that there's other options we really need to consider, and the PUB, because they have that obligation under the Electrical Power Control Act, they're the ones that should be deciding which options should be on the table. And I think that to tell them that they could only consider A versus B is unduly to constrain their ability to do their job.
Yeah, the timing and the terms of reference were a problem, which has furthered the conversation to win-lose and the exaggerations offered by many, and I will say on both sides, which has taken away from the merits and the discussion that we're trying to propose and trying to promote. Mr. Vardy, I certainly appreciate your telephone call today. I look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
I do too. Thank you very much.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye-bye. There we go. Certainly a lot of meat on that bone.